Okay, doctor. Thank you so much for joining all the way from Antigua.
Nice, thank you for
Okay,
having me.
thank you so much for joining. Thanks for accepting the invitation to join the interview session for the FEMBOSS. And here we are. So first of all, let's have the introduction of our today's speakers, today's guest. So over to you, doctor.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Fiona Charles Richards. I'm MSc in clinical psychology, and I'm also doing continued education development. And today we're going to be exploring ADHD.
Thank you so much, doctor. So my first question to you is, what exactly is ADHD?
All right, so for that, I'm going to share some information with you. All right. So when we look at ADHD, we're looking at persistent patterns of inattention or hyperactivity. And that normally interferes with functioning as it relates to developmental aspects of a child. So we're normally going to see those beginning usually in children. So symptoms must persist over a 6-month period. And of course, it is inconsistent with the developmental levels, and that negatively impacts directly with social and academic or occupational activities. Because let's say, for example, we have developed, understand, or recognize that there's a challenge when that person becomes an adult, it affects their working environment more so than anything else. Now, when we look at ADHD, there's 2 aspects that we have to focus on, and those 2 aspects are inattention or attention deficit, or hyperactivity and impulsivity.
Okay, so what can be the signs of ADHD?
Repeat, please.
Yeah, what can be the signs of ADHD? How can anybody determine that the child is suffering from ADHD?
All right, so when we look at ADHD, we're looking at the DSM-5, and that was published in 2013. Again, we're looking at 2 different aspects. So there's inattention or attention deficit. Now, inattention for more than a 6 months period, these are some of the symptoms that we're going to have. Often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities, overlooks or misses details or works inaccurate. So for example, they may have problems in terms of even copying homework. So if you're seeing a challenge with even just them repeating or recognizing their own homework that they're supposed to submit, or even if they were in a meeting, for example, and did not necessarily write down the correct information, or cannot understand their handwriting, or cannot interpret what they have written, it's a red flag that we need to pay attention to. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities, has difficulty remaining focused during lectures, conversations, or lengthy readings. You know, culturally we like to say, or I can't keep still, or always on the go, or things like that. But it is depending on the developmental stage of the child, we have to start looking at what exactly is happening. If this child is changing an activity continuously, like let's say for example, in the span of 5 minutes, they've already done 3 different things that they were supposed to be coloring, but they can't color for more than 5 minutes, or they were supposed to be drawing on a board, or they're supposed to be doing a puzzle, but in 5 minutes, they've already done all 3, or they have attempted to do all 3. That is another sign that we need to pay attention to. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Mind seems to be elsewhere, even in the absence of an obvious distraction. So they're the daydreamers. They're in a class and they're staring off, or they're at work and they're staring off. Often does not follow through with instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace, example tasks, but quickly loses focus and is easily sidetracked. So the person who's at work, and for some reason there's a project that needs to be completed, but they're having extenuating challenges in terms of being able to stay focused on that particular task. In addition to that, you will see often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. So the children who don't necessarily like to be in a classroom for long periods of time, hate homework, that sometimes parents may even get aggressive in terms of they may spank, they may hit, in terms of seeking to get them to pay attention to get the schoolwork done, but they really have some challenges and they really don't want to do it. So we need to look into what is happening there. So even in preparing reports, completing forms, reviewing lengthy papers. So they're not going to be the child that's going to want to read that chapter that they're supposed to read for homework. Or if it requires them to read a chapter where they have to read a chapter and then answer the questions, you may find that they try to either avoid the task, or even if they do the task, it may be a situation where they seek to skip out or they miss the actual information that is required. Often loses things necessary for tasks or activities, school book materials, pens, tools, wallets, keys, paperwork, and glasses, mobile phone. It's often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. Sorry. And for older adolescents and for adults may include unrelated thoughts. It's often forgetful in daily activities, doing chores, running errands, or older adolescents, and that is for older adolescents and adults, returning calls, paying bills, keeping up with appointments. So monthly bills are supposed to be paid. Didn't pay them. There was a particular call they were supposed to return, an important call. Completely forgot about it and said perhaps maybe 2 days later. So these are some of the things that we'll see in some older persons and in adults. Now we have the aspect of hyperactivity and impulsivity. Again, we're looking at a 6 month period. If this is happening for over a 6 month period, then of course you must be mindful and start looking into possibilities of assessing what is happening with this adult or this child. Often fidgets with or taps hands or feet or squirms in seats. Often leaves seats in situations when remaining seated is expected. So not keeping still in the classroom, teachers, means that something is going on with your student. It's not necessarily that they want to misbehave or they can't keep still or they don't want to follow the rules. It is a challenge for them that is experienced when having aspects of hyperactivity and impulsivity that is related to ADHD. Often runs about or climbs in situations where it is inappropriate. So you take them to a function and they are everywhere, right? And often talks excessively. Often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed. And this, for example, looks at completes people's sentences, cannot wait or turn in conversations. Often has difficulty waiting his or her turn. They're not being willful. It is just part of being hyperactive and being impulsive. And often interrupts or intrudes on others, but in conversation, games, activities, may even start using other people's things without even asking or receiving permission. For adolescents and adults, it may be intrude in or take over what others are doing. So those are some of the symptoms that we will see with persons who are having ADHD, whether it be adults or children.
Okay, so ADHD primarily causes the symptoms related to the inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, or a combination of the both. With ADHD, someone may experience difficulty paying attention and staying organized, and excess fidgeting or restlessness, and trouble with the self-control or impulsive behavior. So what are actually considered as ADHD behaviors?
So ADHD, all those that you have mentioned a while ago are considered ADHD behaviors, okay? So a person may, as I said, be impulsive in terms of their thoughts. All these are the symptomologies, and these symptomologies are also linked to behaviors that are noticeable. So once you're seeing these over a 6 month period of time, it is time to start speaking to your pediatrician in terms of your child or your children, the teacher of your school, and perhaps seeking the assistance of a clinician in terms of getting assessments done.
So is ADHD exactly a form of anxiety?
it can be linked to anxiety, but it's not a form of anxiety. ADHD may make someone anxious because, of course, they're being placed in situations where they may have challenges in terms of functioning. Anxiety is actually part of mental health challenges because of a particular situation or because of a particular trauma. So it creates some challenges in terms of, okay, I know that I have maths exams today, but there's 1,000 things happening in terms of sitting still, etc. So those things may make them anxious. Worrying about performance may make them anxious. For adults, worrying about losing your family or losing your job because of a symptomology of ADHD can create anxiety. But no, ADHD is not a form of anxiety.
So is it true that sometimes anxiety can be independently of ADHD and other times it can be as a result of living ADHD?
So as we just discussed, if a person is aware, or maybe in instances where they're not aware, that they have a challenge, because very often we label persons as being rude or difficult without recognizing that perhaps there is a challenge. Now, I may feel a particular kind of way about the person not being able to understand me, or may have certain expectations of me that I know that I may have a challenge being able to meet, because here it is that, I can't sit long for very long times, and it is not that I don't want to do really good at this task, but at the same time, it may take me longer than another person in comparison to another person. And so sometimes parents even compare their children or even compare them to a relative. Those instances when they're found in situations where there's a particular expectation can create anxiety. I mean, even for us as normal people, we get anxious in certain settings. But for someone with an ADHD, not even who may not be necessarily be aware of their challenge, or even if they're aware of their challenge, that in itself creates anxiety, because it is normal for persons to have expectations of us. Now, when we're not able to meet those type of expectations and we're being judged for not being able to meet those type of expectations, of course, there is a linkage between ADHD and being anxious or having the challenges with anxiety, whether it be social anxiety in terms of being able to connect with people, or it could be performance anxiety, because I want to make this A, but can I really truly make this A? Because what happens, persons with ADHD actually need breaks. They take longer periods. So there has to be an adjustment in terms of the expectations that is required of them. But if they don't know what their challenge is, their workplace may be very stigmatized or labeling in terms of when persons may have particular challenges. There are schools who do not accept true students who may have challenges, right? And so all in looking at that, whether it be our cultural setting, whether it be our social settings, whether it be our families, there are some expectations of us, and whether we are able to meet those expectations is going to determine how we control how anxious we get in particular situations, and if we end up with an anxiety issue as a result, or a challenge as a result of having this diagnosis or having these symptomologies, but no diagnosis.
Okay. So some of the triggers like the stress, poor sleep, certain foods, additives, or overstimulation and technology. Once we actually recognize triggers our ADHD symptoms has, so we can make the necessary lifestyle changes to better control the episode. So exactly triggers the ADHD.
So I want to take us to, because ADHD is more so a biological factor than an environmental factor. And even though there are aspects of trauma, etc., it is more so linked to being a genetic and biological aspect than it is just a normal circumstance. So more so, ADHD persons do not have control. They do not necessarily have control because it impacts the frontal lobe of the brain. No, your prefrontal lobe is responsible, this area here, is responsible for making decisions, making rational decisions, being able to problem solve, language, you name it. There are aspects that are important for the frontal region of the brain. Persons who have ADHD have challenges with this, their frontal lobe of the brain, and the frontal lobe of the brain is important for processing information, which is then shared with the other aspects of the brain in terms of even their memory, in terms of even being able to process. So how they process information is going to determine how it is stored in the hippocampus. So there is not necessarily a trigger because it is more of a biological or genetic factor. So it is something that someone may be born with, or there may be an environmental aspect. Whereas, for example, if there's abuse meaning physical, that in itself can have impact in how the brain develops, especially for children under the age of 5. Depending on, for example, if they were held as a prisoner or treated as in a particular way, once it is going to impact the development of the brain, we will see different actions, reactions, impulsivity in terms of how they process information. We will see those things happen. And those are just the environmental factors that can impact brain development. But at the end of the day, it is still internal. Okay, so this is going to require more so in terms of how we help persons manage their impulsivity, in terms of how we help them in terms of managing behaviors. And so it is important for this to be identified early, because guess what? When it is identified early, it means that persons are able to put different things in place. So as we have here, it is mostly genetic. It is the first degree of biological relatives with ADHD. Environmental, although ADHD is correlated with smoking during pregnancy, some of the associations reflect common genetic risk. The minority of cases may be reaction to aspects of the diet. There may be a history of a child abuse, neglect, as we discussed a while ago, multiple foster placements, neurotoxins exposure, infections, etc., alcohol exposure in vitro. That impacts the development of the brain. So at the end of the day, what we are seeing is what happens that impacts brain development. And believe it or not, social factors in terms of abuse and neglect, because guess what? Neglect means the child is not getting adequate nutrients. Neglect means that the child may actually have issues in terms of just being able to connect with the world. And those aspects of things, feeling isolated, etc., can actually shrink brain development too. Okay. And of course, when we look at temporal, we look at association, behavioral inhibition, effortful control. So these aspects are pre-diagnosed in some children with ADHD. So it is also important for us to recognize if there was some aspect of developmental in terms of brain development that affects the level of development for children. So in other words, it is more so of a genetic and environmental factor than it is of triggers. Triggers are going to cause other aspects. So people can have comorbid issues. So people can have anxiety with ADHD or ADHD with anxiety. Persons can have ADHD with depression. Persons can have ADHD with addiction issues. So there's a comorbid aspect of things that can happen as a result of having ADHD, but not necessarily triggered.
Okay, so how exactly ADHD be diagnosed? Does it only include the full physical exam, including the vision and the hearing test? And also the FDA has approved the use of the neuropsychiatric EEG-based assessment aid, NEBA system, a non-invasive scan that measures theta and beta brain waves. So what exactly is the process of diagnosing the ADHD?
All right, so there's no single one test that can diagnose ADHD in children or adults. So we're going to do testing will include intelligence testing, learning abilities, executive functioning, because ADHD affects your executive functions a lot. It includes gathering information and function from multiple environments. So that's going to mean your home, your school, and your social environment. It is not just going to be because you're not doing well in school. It is going to be based on different environments and how you function in those environments. So we have, of course, the neuropsychiatric EEG-based assessment, and this is a non-invasive scan that measure theta and beta brain waves. Theta, ASIO, is lower in children with ADHD, and theta higher. Okay.
Okay, so ADHD can ever go away in children?
No.
Or it
is something that can
the person to adopt.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah, can ADHD ever go away, or it just affect the person into adulthood?
It is more of persons learning to adapt with the challenge once it's diagnosed, because guess what? It is going to impact how you function. So ADHD children can do extremely well in school, but accommodations must be made once the assessment is done. And of course, that will include behavior modifications in terms of how we help them in terms of gaining their impulsivity. And that has to be consistent, because very often we put these models in place, but it's not consistent. And so it has to be consistent. There is also treatment in terms of non-stimulants and stimulants, working on increase in chemicals dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, which plays a key role in thinking and attention. And of course, non-stimulants in terms of helping how they focus, how they retain information. And so for persons who have challenges with ADHD, it means that they have to have accommodations, whether it be in the workplace or whether it be in the schooling or learning environment. So you're giving them perhaps maybe an hour more to do an exam. They're given breaks throughout the exam so that they can burn off some of the levels of their energy, so that they can come back and refocus on doing the task at hand. So that's important. In terms of, because they're going to have other issues in terms of possibly issues with depression, because there's issues with performance, whether it be a possibility of other challenges in terms of the anxiety that we discussed earlier. Therapy is going to be important in terms of them being able to manage the other aspects that may come about as a result of having ADHD. So persons know of Michael Phelps, swimmers in the world, and Michael Phelps has ADHD. And he found that when he worked in water, it was a place where he was able to focus the most. And as a result, he was able to become the best swimmer in the world, gaining several gold medals, etc., and being able to travel. So I don't want people to think at ADHD as a limitation to the life that they can have, because they can have a great life. They can have great outcomes, but it is important for diagnosis to be made early.
So ADHD actually can't be prevented or cured, but spotting it early, plus doing a good treatment and education plan can help a child or adult with ADHD manage their symptoms. So can ADHD ever be cured?
It will never go, just managed. It is going to become part of your life. It is for parents to also help children in being able to identify feelings, in being able to express, in being able to feel, but also giving them an environment that allows them to recognize that they can regulate how they function. Regulate meaning, so children with ADHD may have a lot of tantrums. Lots and lots of tantrums. They may throw fits, they may fall on the ground, they may stomp on the ground. No, there's a reason why that is happening. And the reason why that is happening is because they've mostly internalized a lot of their feelings. A lot is going on in the brain. The brain is going 20 seconds in, there's several things that are happening all at once. And so it is important for persons to not necessarily spank or hit or be aggressive with their child for acting out, but finding them to identify why I'm acting out. So in doing so, it limits and lessens the temper tantrum, because now they can identify, they can pick of all the things that are going on in their head, they can identify what this feeling is and be able to express it. And that in itself allows for children to feel confident, for children to have good self-esteem, for children to be able to have good relationships, being able to connect with others, and being able to function in a social environment.
So ADHD actually tends to ruin families, and in most cases, it's thought that the genes we inherit from our parents are a significant factor in developing the condition. So research actually shows that parents and siblings of someone with ADHD are more likely to have the ADHD themselves. So is ADHD genetic?
Yes. And it is primarily more genetic, as we discussed earlier, than anything else. Okay?
Yeah.
It is mostly genetic than anything else. And as a result of that, it may impact how they behave. It may impact working memory, and impact self-regulation, goal direction, and response to feedback.
Okay, so what does actually trauma cause ADHD? Like stressful events, especially childhood trauma, that predicts ADHD symptoms. And childhood trauma and negatively based memories are risk factors for the affected disorders. So the association of the events bias with the ADHD symptoms may inform us about the etiology of the ADHD. So is it true that the trauma actually causes ADHD?
The trauma can impact persons, and trauma can be, as we indicated, child abuse in terms of physical abuse, or in terms of neglect. And those aspects in terms of how does the frontal lobe process an event, and how does it develop as a result of the different events. 90% of ADHD is caused by genetics. The next 10% is caused by environmental factors, which include issues of neglect in terms of nutrition, in terms of nutrition balance, and in terms of how the frontal lobe has processed a particular event. But the primary cause of ADHD is mostly environmental and genetic.
So is ADHD a type of autism?
Is ADHD a type of
autism?
It is a type of developmental or neurodevelopmental delay or challenge. Because it's brain-based, there are persons who are considered high functioning ADHD, meaning that their brain is able to process things in an exceptional way and be extremely creative, right? So a lot of inventors had ADHD. Okay,
So,
it
so
impacts.
it's true that the ADHD is not on the autism spectrum, but they have some of the same symptoms, and having one of these conditions increases the chances of having the other. Is that correct?
Yes, it allows you to be able to. There are some benefits to be able to having ADHD. I know we focus a lot on the negatives, but there are benefits because ADHD persons can be extremely focused. So it means that they can do tasks without interruption, right? So they may not be able to complete tasks until it's done, and it has to be done in a particular way. Okay. And that may sound a bit autistic, but it is really an aspect also for ADHD. Persons with ADHD, because they have high energy levels, they're able to do, depending on a task that they're encouraged to do, they can use that energy in that particular task, whether it be work, whether it be a sport, or whether it be even academics, but it would depend on how the academics is taught. Okay. So there's several benefits. And as I said, that is how Michael Phelps was able to become the world's best swimmer, because he would have been able to have found a place to use his energy where it was not just only calming for him to function, but it was also a place where he could become successful as a result of having ADHD and the energy or the hyperactivity that comes with having ADHD. So there are some benefits in terms of having ADHD.
So getting angry is like a part of a human experience. So ADHD can make it more intense, and it can impair our ability to respond to the angry feeling healthy way. Some of the time maybe the medication and the psychotherapy can help us manage the anger more effectively in this case. So can
Most
ADHD actually
definitely.
cause the anger issues?
Can ADHD actually cause?
The anger issues.
Well, persons with ADHD, as you would discuss in terms of the aspect of impulsivity that happens in the frontal lobe, they're going to have a lot of mood swings in comparison to a normal person, because it is the frontal lobe is responsible for processing information, for managing impulsivity, and being able to, in terms of regulate or control emotions. Okay. For a person with ADHD, that doesn't necessarily happen in the best way. And so you'll find them to be more impulsive than the normal person. But guess what? They're also they can change their impulsivity into being creative, or being the life of the party, or being funny. But at the same time, they are going to have moods where the impulsivity of that mood may not necessarily be interpreted in the best of ways. So yes, you will see anger coming out, because guess what? How they have interpreted a particular situation or information or stimuli may be in the negative. And for us who may interpret things in the negative, we may take a step back and we may interpret how we would want to respond, if this is the appropriate environment to respond in this particular way. But a person with ADHD goes from stimuli to response immediately. Okay, so yes, you will see anger a lot more in terms of a person who has not learned to how to regulate, or have been taught, or have been given aspects of behavior modification from since they were young. So some preschools may even have timeout for children. Parents may utilize that in home, but there are different ways of helping them modify their impulsive based on understanding that they're not being rude, but there's actually a developmental delay happening within their brain, or a neuropsychological factor has been happening as a result of genetics, or an environmental aspect that has impacted how their brain develops.
Okay. So people with ADHD have impaired short-term or the working memories. Research that actually shows by the research. As a result, they may have a difficulty remembering assignments or completing the tasks that require the focus or the concentration. So is it true that can ADHD actually causes the memory loss?
I wouldn't say that it causes memory loss. ADHD, and most of us, how we function, there is a stimuli, whether it be internal or external, and there is a way in which we process that stimuli. Okay. Now, if, for example, they were thinking about several things at the same time, it would mean that the information did not process to be saved in the hippocampus. And so, yes, they may have issues in terms of working memory, in terms of recall. Recall for them may take a longer period of time because of how the information was processed. So it's not a matter of having memory loss, because memory loss is actually a damaging of the hippocampus, as opposed to recognizing that it is whether or not they have processed the stimuli that were given, or whether it actually went through the process to be stored in long-term or short-term memory.
Okay. So is it true that the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder typically does not get worse with the age? The person is aware of the symptoms and knows how to manage them. So is it true that the ADHD worsen with the age? Or it's wrong?
It can worsen with the age. If there has been no intervention, if there has been no modification, if there has been no medication. I mean, like, children who have ADHD can, as I said, how they process a stimuli or an information, how they process feedback would be information, reaction. And that may not necessarily be the best way, because guess what? It can get them in trouble. They can stab their classmate with a pencil, not because they're being rude, but just because of how they've processed and how their impulsivity works. So they may actually hit a classmate, which may either get them labeled as being rude, and persons may not necessarily pay much attention to them. This continues into adulthood, and if the responses is happening the same, that can be them getting in trouble with the law very often, because there has been no interventions in terms of developing or refining their impulse aspect or reaction to things, the impulsive reaction. So it can worsen with age if there has been no interventions whatsoever.
So with ADHD, a child or teen may have rapid or impulsive speech like physical restlessness and trouble focusing, irritability, and sometimes defiant or oppositional behavior. So what does an ADHD episode actually looks like?
Okay, and for that, I think it would be best for me to share this story once it allows me to.
Yeah,
and
sure.
so viewers can have an idea as to what it would look like, because me explaining it may sound a particular way, but seeing it in action may be different. One second. One second.
Yeah, sure. Please do.
So there you have it in the life of someone who has ADHD and what it sounds like for them. Hold on 1 second. Okay. I think my YouTube decided to have to play my kids' cartoons. Right. Okay. Right. So for them, it is a struggle. It's a daily struggle in terms of being able to manage different things that are happening in their head. As she said, it's like having a constant party for 19 years with thousands of thoughts and things happening. And without having her medication, she's not able to distinguish between how to focus between the different thoughts happening in her head and being able to pull from one of them and be able to do what is required throughout her days. And so for them, it is indeed challenging. And sometimes I wonder if I have ADHD, but I've never been tested. And there's not many persons in Antigua that does testing. So, and testing is really supposed to be done by Clinsight, but culturally we have left that in the hands of psychiatrists when it's really shouldn't be their job to do, because there are so many aspects of ADHD that will need to be understood and identified so that persons are able to modify different aspects of what shows up in their ADHD. So if, for example, we recognize that working memory is low, so we get to recognize from the assessments done as a clinician what areas of academics is being impacted by your ADHD. We get to identify different aspects of work and memory, critical thinking, etc. We get to identify, is there now an emotional component or another psychological factor that has to be considered that we have to address? So we're able to say, hey, this person's going to need to have therapy as a result of looking at the type of assessments that clinicians do. And very often, culturally, we have decided what is accommodating than what should be accommodated. And we have to consider, are we doing things in the best interest of our children, so that they can have possible outcomes? Because yes, in some instances, they may need medication, but in some instances, they may also need behavior modifications. Thus, having just medication is not going to fix the challenges that persons with ADHD have. So it is important for us to be able to recognize what type of assessment that our children need, recognize that our children need an assessment and they're not just being rude, and recognize that there are different types of accommodations and help that our children can have, or assistance that they can have. And in addition to that, being able to get them involved in areas that they can use and burn their energy so that they can focus, and helping them have the best possible life outcome, because it is possible.
So how does ADHD actually affect the brain?
How does it affect the last word?
How ADHD actually affect the brain? Does it actually lowers the level of dopamine in the body? That is the hormone involved in our brain pleasure center.
Yes, it does. It does create a chemical imbalance within the brain, because again, there are different things that are happening in terms of how the body processes the chemicals that are happening as a result. And so we also have to be able, and so that is what the drug does. That is for persons who need prescriptions, that is what the drug does. It is able to allow for balancing different chemicals that are happening within the brain. So it even lowers the amount of neurotransmitters that are being processed by that person. Not having enough dopamine can interfere with cognitive processes like focusing and attention. And so that is exactly what or why treatment is required. We see that there's a difference in even your glutamate signaling in some regions of the brain may have a role as it relates to adults with ADHD. So yes, it does have an imbalance in teen between your dopamine levels and your norepinephrine levels within both children and in adults as well.
So ADHD actually treated as neurological, that is affecting how the brain concentrates things. So ADHD, does ADHD actually count as disability?
It is required, it's important for ADHD to be tested. It is important. And so it is when they use the non-invasive scanning that we would have indicated earlier. It is going to involve the actual assessment, both educational, intelligence, both academics, and other aspects in terms of emotional functioning as well.
So does ADHD actually affect the sleep as well?
Yes, it does. Because one is that impulsive and have that much energy, that energy is not burned off. As she indicated, if you take that too late, because again, we are chemical. Every single one of us are made up of chemicals. Once different chemicals respond differently, and that in itself impacts sleep, impact how we are able to calm down ourselves. And so hence the reason having them have therapy, because learning how to breathe, how to calm your body, how to quiet your mind, even doing yoga, different types of activities that helps you to calm oneself is important in terms of persons having some sleep.
So is it true that the adult ADHD sleep problems may include the forgetfulness and difficulty in concentrating?
Well, we know that ADHD creates an impact in concentrating, in paying attention. However, for us who are normal, if we do not get good sleep before a night, before an exam, being able to process, being able to remember can be impacted by lack of sleep. For a person who is completely hyper all the time, yes, it can impact how they recall information during the exam. It can impact how they focus on the exam on the day. It can have different levels of impact in terms of even our social relationships, even how we function at work. And as she indicated earlier, having that midday nap can be essential in even just rebooting the person to handle the rest of the day.
So ADHD, the medication or therapy or the combination of the both of the best.
Repeat that for me, Didi.
Does ADHD need the medication, just the medication or therapy, or the combination of both is of the best all the time?
It will require a combination of all. Because as you would have discussed earlier, there can be issues with depression, there can be issues with anxiety, there can be different aspects as a result of having ADHD. There can be issues with self-esteem for persons who are not performing well, and things like that. So when we have done an assessment and we get to look at the emotional aspect of it, we're going to get to see how the person connects with the world, how they feel in connection is with the world. Do they feel connected with the world? We're going to get to pick up on different aspects of how they are functioning emotionally. And so based on what we've discovered, how they're functioning emotionally, psychotherapy or therapy or cognitive development therapy, the different ranges, the different types of therapy that can fit that particular individual. Whether it be CBT, in terms of thinking about a possibility of how A/B affects your particular thought pattern, how we're going to shift that impact or thought process, how we're going to process, how we're going to help them to feel good about themselves, okay? Especially in different cultural environments where these aspects are not normalized, where people are very judgmental in terms of how we are culturally. And it's amazing that ADHD is more prominent and more recognizable, easier in our boys, but it does not mean that our girls do not have ADHD. You know, boys may be a bit more rambunctious, they may play more, etc., etc. And so we may see that we may be able to identify it easier in the gender, but it does not mean that just because a girl may sit still for a particular period of time, is she shaking? Is she tapping her fingers? Is she rocking? In terms of how she may even function because of our cultural settings.
So is it true that MRI actually can diagnose ADHD?
If we can actually,
Diagnose ADHD and
yes,
MRI, that is magnetic resonance imaging, can
um,
diagnose
we would
ADHD?
prefer the non-invasive one that we would have discussed with the EEGBT than utilizing a lot of radiation, because again, for a person to do an MRI requires a person to sit still for a particular period of time. And that is going to be extremely challenging unless that person has been given a medication to do so, in terms of sitting still to have an MRI done. So the most invasive way would be the best approach in terms of deciding what is happening with the person. And it would be easier in some, unless there is not another neurological component that shows up in an assessment, whether it be their issues in terms of how left brain and left hemisphere functions in a particular test that requires another further diagnosing, because it could be that there's another issue that could have caused the person having ADHD. Is there a tumor on the frontal lobe of the brain? Did the person have injury to the frontal aspect of the brain? Because what we have found is that persons who have had a frontal lobe injuries are also extremely impulsive and can be categorized as having ADHD issues. We have seen changes in personality as a result of persons having frontal lobe damages. So only in an aspect such as that has indicated that they may have had some impact to the brain and how that can affect other aspects, then we would recommend an MRI. But for an assessment allows a clinician to be able to see different functioning levels of a person. And if we need to do another aspect, we can look at the data and theta waves to indicate what is happening, which is the less invasive, right? Because we know that doing MRI has a lot of radiation, and that in itself can even create other challenges for a person.
So what exactly ADHD mood swings is like? Does it include anger, anxiety, frustration, or disappointment intensely than others? Or are there any
it will be a lot more intense than others, because again, how a person with ADHD processes a stimuli is basically stimuli response, and that's that, as opposed to it being that type of process in terms of should I react that way in this setting? Maybe I should. They're not going to be able to do that, especially if there has not been some modifications done in terms of behavior, in terms of helping them to understand that this is what the process should look like. So yes, you will find that you have more anger in persons who have ADHD, who have not, one, been diagnosed, and have both, two, have not been given different types of intervention to help them with their thought processes.
Okay, so what can be the most effective treatment for ADHD? Does it include medication, which include the stimulants and the stimulants? Are these the best known treatments?
The better type of treatment is holistic treatment. Holistic treatment including behavior modifications in their environment, whether it be school or in home, and being able to make that consistent across the board. In terms of psychotherapy or therapy or CBT therapy, just some form of therapy. And of course, in some extreme cases, especially when we have severe or mild persons with mild or severe ADHD, it will be important for them to have medication.
You actually mentioned recently that there are some benefits of having ADHD, including the hyperfocusing is a state an individual with ADHD can focus on a task for hours on it. It's essentially tuning out everything of that, including the resilience, including the creativity, conversational skills and humanity, and spontaneity and courage and energy. Are there any other benefits as well of having ADHD?
Well, those are the benefits, but I'm sure there may be others in terms of, especially you'll find some persons who may struggle in the classroom be able to function better at a sport or something that involves their hand than someone who doesn't have ADHD. But being able to identify what their strengths and weaknesses are is important, and that may be different depending on the case. So if you have ADHD and I have ADHD, you may have mild, I may have severe. You may have very, very low aspects of it. And so how we treat each case is different. And benefits, etc. Because when the young lady said that there are people who indicated that she should be happy that she has been able to have ADHD medication, for her, it was being able to have some sense of normalcy. It allowed her to focus better on her task. Whereas even some persons, there are people who use ADHD medication to ace exams, which is illegal, by the way, right? So there are benefits because guess what? They can do extremely well academically as well, but it is essential for us to be able to recognize what those challenges are and support their development.
So here we wrap up with our introduction today. So do you want to add something more about ADHD from yours?
For me, I want parents to be more involved. I want parents to be more aware. And so as parents, and we're becoming interested, I mean, if there's something going on with your child that concerns you, it's better to ask a question than to let somebody else tell you, well, you know, my child didn't talk until they were 5. And actually, we're recognizing that in speech delays, there are persons with speech delays, and this is happening more than 15 years ago, that persons with speech delays in some aspects have or may have ADHD. So that may even be one of the signs that we may not even have recognized before, because there's so much stimulation happening as well. You know, before our children are 5, they're exposed to the television because everybody has a TV in the home. Everybody has a phone in the home now. And so depending on the type of stimuli that the brain is receiving may also require it to, the neurotransmitters may process information a lot faster than 20 years ago. I remember when I was becoming a certified teacher educator, that one of the things we recognized was that we had it was 2 in 100 or 2 in 50 persons had ADHD. Now we have 3 in 25 having ADHD. So I really want to encourage parents to be more mindful, to be more interested, to ask the questions, to do the research, to find ways that will provide optimal outcomes for their children.
Okay. So thank you, Doctor, for joining today's interview session on topic ADHD. Do you want to some our viewers think about GW group and friendship, or how was your journey with the GW?
I started off being a teacher. And it was because I was a teacher that I saw that there were challenges that my students were having that persons may not necessarily pay attention to. And that drove me to want to understand more about how I can help and support families and their children and give them support in terms of, will it be in terms of helping the school understand that this is a challenge and how they can support having the children having these challenges, not recognizing it as a disability because it really isn't, because there's so many benefits that children can have from having this, but how we treat it, you know, depending on our cultural backgrounds, etc., is important. And so that was my drive. I would have studied at the University of Cave Hill in Barbados, and also at the University of Mona campus in Jamaica. And my lecturer, some of our lecturers are practicing clinicians. And so based on the different areas it was interesting in terms of recognizing that, there's some issues also that persons may need hypnosis for, in terms of their different challenges and things like that. And being able to recognize that being a clinician doesn't mean just functioning in this particular box, but being able to recognize that there are other techniques that can be utilized, modern techniques also that can be utilized, acupuncture, et cetera, that can be utilized in treating different conditions that our clients may have. So I'm excited about the journey. It ain't finished yet, as we grow, as we learn, as we develop, and as we are exposed to different avenues, it is a learning journey. And so I'm excited about the journey. I'm excited about the journeying and learning.
So doctor, do you want to tell something about our WhatsApp group or how was journey with our WhatsApp group across the GWP group, Global Women in Psychology, and our friendship? How did you get to know about it and anything?
FemBoss, it was interesting because very often we don't recognize that when we stand up on different social medias, whether it be LinkedIn, whether it be Instagram, etc., how important it is to say who we are and recognize our strengths in the community that we serve in terms of being clinicians, being therapists, being working with issues of mental health challenges, and how important that is. And so it was because I started up, my LinkedIn address that I was able to connect with you. And in connecting with you, I've been exposed to so many professionals around the world, from Africa, the US, the UK, etc. And that in its sense gives me a sense of belonging, in terms of a place to belong, in terms of a place to have discussions as well, concerning different challenges that peer persons may have, or if you came across a case that is new, there's a place where you can actually say, hey, you know what, this is new. Have anybody had experience in dealing with whatever the case is, and being able to connect with professionals that allows you to even think or expose you to something that you perhaps didn't even recognize that you could do. So it has been great in terms of being part of the organization and being part of FemBoss.
Thank you so much for joining today's session. I'm so glad to see you.
Glad to finally see you too. All right, it was a pleasure being here, and thanks for having me. I look forward to doing it again.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it again.
Awesome. Have an awesome weekend. All right, take care.
Yes. Okay, take care.
All right.